I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners! On this edition of the program, we continue our coverage of the Iran War, this time with returning guest James Dorsey, independent scholar and journalist of all things Middle East. He hosts the Turbulent World with James M. Dorsey Substack, and we'll be talking about the latest developments in the war and how this war is bad all the way around for everyone. The U.S., Israel, Iran, Europe, the Gulf states. That's going to be the bigger picture hanging over this episode's discussion. But before we get to that conversation, I'd like to remind you that this program is almost entirely listener funded, with the exception of my sponsor, the mighty Mike Swanson of wallstreetwindow.com. So if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And also check out my sponsor, Mike Swanson's trading and financial newsletter, Wall Street Window, at wallstreetwindow.com. I've had listeners make a return on investment thanks to Mike's trading tips, and I highly recommend his work. It is the best financial and trading newsletter around. With that out of the way, let's get to it with James Dorsey making his regular visit to the Parallax Views podcast. Welcome back to Parallax Views, friend of the show, multi-time guest, and someone who has been very gracious with his time when it comes to this program. I want to thank James M. Dorsey for coming back on Parallax Views. We're going to be discussing the situation with the Iran war, and we'll probably go in a number of different directions. How are you doing, James?
Good morning or good night, JG. Pleasure to be with you again. I'm doing fine, trying to keep up with what's happening.
So your initial thoughts, James, on the speech that Trump gave about the Iran war?
I thought that the speech was part fact, part half-truth, and part fiction. If measured by the expectations that Trump created in the run-up to the speech, it's not clear that he met those expectations. In other words, a lot of people had expected that he would be addressing the American public at large, and in doing so would focus on economic issues, particularly the fallout of the Iran war. Instead, domestically, this seemed to be much more a pep talk for his Make America Great Again support base. With regard to Iran, he repeated what he'd said before. He did not address the fact that the Iranians were denying that they were discussing or had asked the United States for a ceasefire. He didn't identify who he's talking to in Iran. In other words, he did, and also in his Truth Social posting just before the, or about 12 hours before the national address, in which he spoke about the newly elected president, it wasn't clear whether that was President Pezeshkian, who was elected last year, or whether he was referring to some other unidentified figure. And the speech was contradictory. In other words, if, as he has claimed repeatedly, the United States has fulfilled its war goals, then why do we need another 2 weeks? And again, if the United States has fulfilled its war goals, however they may be defined, nuclear, ballistic missiles, relationships with non-state actors elsewhere in the Middle East, if those goals have been fulfilled, then why do you need to bomb the country back to the Stone Age?
Right. Those were his exact words too, bombing back to the Stone Age.
Those were his, both in the national address and on Truth Social. if you wish, the speech raised as many questions as it, or even more questions than it answered.
Do you think Trump is in the dark about what the future is? I don't want to speculate too much, but it just seemed it was a very odd speech to me.
Look, I'm not going to try and read Trump's mind.
Fair enough.
So, with other words, whether this was a deliberate tactic of trying to confuse the enemy and not signal what he really wants or does not want to do, or whether this was just a spur of the moment rambling, your guess is as good as mine.
Were there any other takeaways you had from it, or should we move on to more broadly what is happening?
Not fundamentally. I mean, the one comment that I will make is what, and the thought that I had listening to the speech or to the address was that Trump, 4 weeks into the war, hasn't in any form or fashion adjusted his approach. In other words, he didn't expect it to come this far. He expected that with the power of the presidency, the power of the United States, the display of overwhelming military might, there would be a capitulation of Iran. There hasn't been a capitulation, nor has there been a split in the regime. We've seen regime cohesion, both on the military side as well as on the political side. Iran clearly has suffered enormous damage as a result of the Israeli and American bombings. I have no doubt that its military manufacturing capabilities have been severely curtailed, that its missile drone stockpiles have been severely curtailed. But Iran is still firing drones and missiles, and whether or not they're intercepted and it's debris that hits a target, or whether the missile itself gets through, doesn't really matter that much. You don't need that many missiles to make the point and to increase your leverage by unsettling the global energy market, by maintaining the pressure on Gulf states, and it's increasingly, in a sense, boxing Trump into a corner. Because fact of the matter is that if Trump were to declare victory today, it's a declaration that would basically ring hollow. On the nuclear issue, supposedly that was achieved in June of last year when the United States bombed 3 Iranian nuclear facilities. If it's the issue of the 480 kilograms of highly enriched uranium that Iran still possesses and that supposedly are buried under the rubble of a nuclear facility, that hasn't been retrieved. As long as Iran can fire missiles, the goal of obliterating the missile stockpile has not been achieved. So in a sense, Iran has Trump boxed in with no good options. And the problem with that is that the only real option he then has is an escalation of an expansion of the war.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about Saudi Arabia. So I'm reading all kinds of contradictory reports, and I know we mentioned this last time with, I believe it was that Washington Post report that was saying bin Salman pushed for this war, and you said we should take that with a grain of salt. The New York Times last week had an article, Saudi leader is said to push Trump to continue Iran war in recent calls. The Guardian writes, Saudi Arabia urging U.S. to ramp up attacks on Iran, intelligence source confirms. But then I'm also seeing from the Financial Times, Saudi Arabia bridles at Donald Trump's way of waging war. And I guess Trump may have also insulted bin Salman recently during it. I don't know what happened there. I was behind on the news.
Well, essentially, none of this fundamentally contradicts each other. There's no doubt in my mind that the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, prior to the start of the war, were urging the United States and Trump particularly not to launch a war. They did not want to see this because as much as Iran was a problem, they felt that they were managing the problem. They didn't say this, but fundamentally, they also felt that the pretext of a nuclear weapon was a fabrication, was a pretext. It really wasn't an immediate and real threat. Not to say that it couldn't have become a threat over time, but it was not a threat that justified breaking off negotiations that seemingly were progressing and launching a war. Now, having said that, midway through the war, if there were to be an abrupt ending to the war, or in any case, the United States pulling out of the war, that would be leaving the Gulf states in a worse situation than they were before. Before that, they had manageable relations with an Islamic Republic that wanted to have manageable relations with the Gulf states and had no reason to back away from that. If the war were to end today, they will be dealing with an Islamic Republic that feels emboldened, that has come out of this, in their minds, victorious, with increased leverage in the Strait of Hormuz, over the Gulf states, and aggrieved at having been unjustifiably attacked in their view. So the notion,
not to interrupt you, but it sounds like what you're saying is before the war started, they probably didn't want this, but now since it started, maybe there's a sense of, well, the U.S. might as well dig in.
Well, I think that I think the divisions on that in the Gulf, and you have the Emiratis who are the most out front, and also have interests of their own, who have basically indicated that if there were a occupation of Iranian islands close to the Strait of Hormuz, they would be willing to participate in that. Keep in mind that 3 of those islands are islands that they claim, that the UAE claims as its own territory, that were occupied not by this Iranian government, but by the Shah in 1971, at the time that the Emirates became independent. You have the Saudis who've warned Iran that they're nearing the limits of their patience, and have pointed to what they project as their military capabilities, who have given the United States greater access to overflight and airspace, as well as to a second Saudi airbase. You have the Bahrainis, who, New York Times had satellite pictures of ballistic missiles being fired from bases in Bahrain, whoever was firing them, towards Iran. And then on the other extreme, you have Qatar and Oman, who want an immediate and negotiated ceasefire to end this. And those are the 2 states who historically, traditionally, have had better relations with Iran for various reasons.
So what's the main takeaway people should be getting from any discussion of the Gulf states in relation to this?
I think the main takeaway is that, the Gulf states are themselves in a bind. They have no other security partner to turn to but the United States. But the United States is a partner who's proven to be unpredictable and because they get dragged as they could get dragged into a conflict that they were not consulted about and they did not want to see happen. Now, what I think that means in practice is that once the war is over and the dust has settled, you're going to see the Gulf states wanting to renegotiate those hosting agreements. Not so much because they want to curb the hosting of U.S. forces, but because they will apply conditions, including being consulted, including what does the defense shield mean? Access to weaponry, all different, all of these issues that have become obvious as a result of this war.
So I also wanted to ask, I have people that bristle when I say that the Saudis probably did not want this war, because I mean, there's a lot of people, at least in the US, that turn this into a weird tribal politics where it's about good guys and bad guys, which I'm not a fan of that. Um, but how do you respond to people that really want to pin all of this on the Gulf states? Like, what would you say to a listener that just thinks, well, does that mean the Saudis are the good guys? Because I don't think it's a good guy, bad guy thing.
Well, first of all, the good guy, bad guy dichotomy has two dimensions. One is there has been a demonization of the United States and Iran. There's been a demonization of Iran in the United States. And what are widely held beliefs in the United States that have come to live lives of their own are not necessarily what is reality on the ground and what is historically accurate. There's a second warring aspect to me in the good guy, bad guy dichotomy, and that is that there's a religious undertone to it. And it's a religious undertone that we've seen being expressed more explicitly, increasingly, in the Pentagon. You saw that at the last Pete Hegseth news conference, in which he ended it with a Christian prayer. And you see this in some of what U.S. troops being sent into the war theater, or into, in any case, being deployed to the Middle East, are being told in terms of phrases like a holy war.
I'm curious. I hope this isn't a curveball question, but did you happen to see Robert Kagan's recent article in The Atlantic?
Yes, I did.
America is now a rogue superpower, where I think what he's essentially arguing is that Trump has abandoned the alliance-based international order it helped foster after World War II, and it has gone rogue, and that this U.S.-Israel war against Iran is just accelerating our own geopolitical isolation and even empowering rival powers. Now, there's some more interesting elements to that essay where he gets into the idea that maybe we shouldn't have been involved with Israel for all these decades. And I think people have been focusing on that when talking about the article. I was wondering, have you read it and what are your reactions to it?
Look, it's interesting. It's interesting that this argument comes from Robert Kagan,
Right, the uber neocon.
who was widely viewed as sort of the ideological voice of the neoconservatives over the decades. I think and I think what is true that comes back to something I said initially in this conversation, which is Trump's belief in the overwhelming power of his office of the United States and of U.S. military superiority. And I think in his mind, that was confirmed with the abduction of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. It was confirmed in Panama. and essentially confirmed in his mind um, with Greenland, with his ability to persuade NATO to substantially increase their defense budgets and defense spending. So I think that's the frame of mind. And it's a policy that's basically built on might is right, not on international law, not on multilateralism. And sure, if you want to derive or to conclude from that the United States has become a rogue superpower, that's one way of looking at it. And it's not totally inaccurate. Now, I think there are two other aspects to it. One is where particularly with Trump's raging against what he calls NATO, but really is U.S. allies, Europe, Japan, South Korea, the last two not being NATO members, of not being willing to support the United States in the Strait of Hormuz. No doubt the U.S. has lost credibility. But as long as there's not an alternative to the United States is what it is. The Chinese, we'll see what the Chinese do. They're being asked by the mediators to be a guarantor for whatever agreement to end the war, if there's an agreement to end the war. I think Trump is accurate in saying that he can pull out, as far as he's concerned, without formally ending the war or an agreement with the Iranians. So,
well, has he even really called it a war? Doesn't Congress, I think, has to approve, but that's why they're calling it Operation Epic Fury.
He has at times used the word war, but he's by and large tried to steer away from that because of the legal implications, which would involve Congress. But my point is that the Chinese do have an opportunity, if they wish to do so, to project themselves in a very different way from the way that they've projected themselves up until now. Whether they're interested in providing guarantees, that would be a major step for them. And then the question would be, what are those guarantees? And whether or not those are the kind of guarantees that Iran would feel is sufficient. So it's a balancing act for China. What we have seen, I think, and that doesn't fundamentally alter things, but it is an important shift, is that various countries that would not have gravitated towards China before the war, or before Trump at least, are now building relationships. So whether that's, you saw a stream of European leaders visit Beijing. You've seen remarkably the Philippines saying that they would be willing to jointly explore with China oil and gas fields in the South China Sea. Those are significant changes. They may not fundamentally alter the picture yet, but they are fundamental changes. The third thing I want to say is regard to Israel. Israel's going to be the scapegoat in this, without question.
That's really interesting, because I was going to say, real quick, well, go on. I'm sorry. I shouldn't interrupt you.
No, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, one of the things that stood out to me about Kagan's piece was he said, the Israelis should think really long and hard about, if the U.S. is willing to betray other allies, at some point it will be willing to do that to Israel.
In principle, yes. I think there's several issues here. Does Israel bear responsibility? Absolutely, it does. It has been a major driver in the demonization of Iran and in the assertions that were not always shared by U.S. intelligence of what Iranian intentions were in terms of nuclear and where they were in the process if they were developing a nuclear weapon. Now, having said that, I think it's, you'd also have to keep in mind that Trump has been raging against Iran since the 1980s. He's been on the warpath. It's not that he discovered Iran through the United States, sorry, through Israel. On top of which, the United States has its own fish to fry with Iran. This is, and the Iranians have made their own significant contributions to being viewed as a demon. But, you have in the United States, you have, of course, the whole anti-American posturing of the revolution. You have the occupation of the U.S. embassy in Tehran for 444 days. You have the 1982 or 83 blowing up of the U.S. embassy in Beirut by a Iran affiliate. The blowing up of the U.S. Marine barracks in which 241 Marines were killed. You have the 1996 attack in Saudi Arabia in Khobar Tower, in which a number of American military personnel were killed. And of course, you have the support and the improvised explosive devices in Iraq. So the United States has a lot of fish to fry with Iran that's independent of the Israelis. What I have no doubt about is that the Israelis capitalized on that. And they seized a moment of opportunity that also was fed by what we were discussing before, Trump's belief that there was nothing he couldn't do. So, so there's enough blame to go round here. The third and last thing I'll say about Israel is that, yes, Israel's going to suffer as a result of this, but Israel is the one country that has a significant grassroots support base in the United States that goes far beyond an ethnic or religious community. So it's, the Jewish community. I mean, the real bulk of Israeli grassroots support are the evangelists. And that makes a big difference. So this is not just a country that needs to buy a lobbying firm. It's sure, it has a very strong lobbying arm, but one of the reasons why that lobbying arm is strong is because of that kind of grassroots support.
I wanted to ask you, I mean, you were sort of being nuanced there, saying there's some real bad blood between the U.S. and Iran. And one thing I hear, at least here in Trump land, aka Florida, is people say to me, well, the Iranians started this war. This war has been going on for 47 years. And I don't think people understand the stakes here of what Trump has done, because you can say all you want that there's bad blood. Iran didn't start this war. I mean, this was a war prosecuted by Trump and Israel. And I think there's real implications to that within the sort of sphere of how wars are prosecuted, why they're prosecuted, the legality, etc. How important do you think that is? Because I think Kagan and Christo are also thinking in that term of, well, this is like executive overreach.
Look, I'm not saying that the Iranians started this war, and they started this war 47 years ago.
No, I understand that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the Iranian-U.S. relationship has been a very troubled relationship from day one of the Islamic Revolution. There's no question about it. Does that justify this war? By no means. It does. There's no question about it. So Uh, I mean, you know, again, it's a little bit like Hamas in Israel. Did Hamas start the war on the 7th of October? Sure, it did. It attacked. Was that an attack that took place in a vacuum? No, it didn't. And to, you know, and this, so this is a war that was started by the United States and Israel. And frankly, I think the United States would have done much better if it wanted to wage war, justified or not, if it had done this on its own and not involved Israel. Even if the Israelis may have contributed to the decision making, this would have been in some ways a lot cleaner if they had not asked or agreed to the Israelis joining them.
How do you think this affects the sort of European side of things? I know you wrote a piece recently, Iran weakens Trump in his European culture wars. And the far right does, at least in Europe, seems to have fractures over the Iran war.
Absolutely. Well, I think, obviously, I think there are two aspects when we're talking about Europe. The piece I wrote was indeed about the far right and not Europe as such. And the argument that I was making was that there were already fractures within the far right because of Venezuela and because of Greenland. The issue, not that the far right was enamored with Nicolas Maduro, they were not, but they carry sovereignty high in their flag. And both of those were violations of sovereignty, which is also how they see Iran, even if they're, these are often not Islamophobic groups and anti-immigration groups, but they do uphold the principle of sovereignty. So Iran has contributed to the further fracturing of the far right, and the fracturing of the far right comes at a moment at which one, it weakens Trump's national security strategy, which really in Europe was at least partly based on the far right. It comes at a moment at which the French far right, the National Rally, failed to take a single mayorship in a major French city in elections last month. And the polls don't look good on April 12 for Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who is the darling of the model of the far right. So that's one aspect of it. I think the other aspect of it is, of course, that this is going to give a further bolt to European thinking in terms of defense and self-sufficiency, particularly with Trump's veiled threats of withdrawing, for example, from NATO. I mean, as much as Gulf states view the United States as an unreliable and unpredictable partner, so do Europeans. Now, the issue for the Europeans is, or we're going to have to wait and see what happens in the next days, maybe a couple of weeks, with regard to the Strait of Hormuz. As a matter of principle, assuming that the Iranians retain control or some degree of control over the Strait of Hormuz, then if and when the United States pulls out of the war, if the Iranians are smart, they declare it open for all shipping but the United States and Israel. The question is, how are they going to handle all kinds of things, including they need, if you're not going to get sanctions relief, and if there is a U.S. withdrawal without an agreement, then the Iranians are going to have to raise money. Part of that will be through oil exports and so on. but they're also, they have significant expenses as a result of the bombing, the enormous damage that has to be rebuilt. And so you'll certainly see an effort at imposing tolls or passageway fees. That'll have to be agreed with the Omanis. The Iranians can't do that unilaterally. And it'll have to be agreed with the Europeans and others whose ships go through those straits. So we'll have to see how this all unfolds.
What do you make of Trump lashing out at allies like the UK and particularly France? And I think even Macron in France has sort of responded to some of Trump's claims, specifically the idea that France banned all U.S. military overflights, and he just said that's not true. But I do think France has been sort of like, we don't want to be involved in this the way you are.
The Europeans don't want part of it. And if you see the statement that was put out by the Brits and I think 34 other countries earlier this week, it was a statement for trying to, find arrangements post-war. And it was very clear that they do not want to get involved in the war. Trump, basically is he's not using those words, but in a sense, he's saying you're a part of NATO, you have to join, which is sort of a bit of a weird interpretation of Article 5 of NATO, which is the attack of one is an attack on the other. Fact of the matter is the United States went to war with no consultation. And now that it didn't quite develop the way Trump had envisioned, he needs help in trying to get out of this. And people aren't willing to take the coals out of the fire for him.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too because I know Trump on his little Truth Social platform has made comments alluding to the idea that he could end the war in Iran, but the Strait of Hormuz wouldn't necessarily be reopened. And Axios is reporting on this actually. And one of the things Axios has pointed out that if that's the case, the U.S. would be leaving other countries to just clean up what is now an economic quagmire.
Well, there's another aspect here. Trump can claim, and he may actually be correct in that the United States is not dependent on the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz for its own oil supply. But it is dependent on the flow through the Strait of Hormuz of products, including fertilizer. A lot of U.S. fertilizer goes through the Strait of Hormuz, or helium. And of course, what happens in the Strait of Hormuz is one driver of oil prices. So if there's no opening of the Strait of Hormuz, once the U.S. is no longer involved in the war, that's still going to affect Americans at the gas pump. So his argument with regard to the Strait of Hormuz is simplistic at best. But the issue is, what interest do the Iranians have in keeping the Strait of Hormuz almost closed, because there are ships going through with their consent, once the United States pulls out? There's no logic for that. On the contrary, Iran has every interest in opening it, with some restrictions with regard to U.S. shipping, for example, Israeli shipping.
I'm curious, how important do you think it is that people realize that the Strait of Hormuz crisis, as the World Economic Forum has called it yesterday in an article, how important do you think it is that people understand that this isn't just affecting oil? I mentioned the World Economic Forum because they have a piece out entitled "The Strait of Hormuz Crisis Affects More Than Just Oil. Here are 9 other commodities affected by this." How important do you think that is to understanding what's happening right now and the consequences?
If you're an American farmer dependent on fertilizer going through the Strait of Hormuz, it's very important. If you're a chip maker, it's very important. So the answer is absolutely. This is not a conflict. This is maybe geographically a far from my bed conflict. It's not a far from my bed conflict. It's a conflict that im impacts people and segments of the important segments of the population and the economy across the globe.
What do you make of have you been following how the right wing has been reacting to this in the US? Because the polling I'm seeing seems to indicate that most of the Republican base is supportive of Trump still, but I mean, I think things can get distorted because we see all these MAGA sort of public figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tucker Carlson raging against Operation Epic Fury. What do you think is going on with the MAGA base?
Look, I think that again, there are probably better people to address this than I am. But what I see is indeed in the polling, the overwhelming majority of the Republican base supports the war and supports Trump. But that's what, 30% of the population, roughly? I mean, if you look at the overall figures, support for the war was always below 50 and is dropping. Now, in the elite circles of the Republican Party, and particularly the Make America Great Again faction of it, there's a split. There's no question about it. The Tucker Carlsons, the Taylor Greene, all of these people, Megyn Kelly, and so on. How much does that trickle down? I find that I don't have an assessment of it. Sure, they have immense numbers of followers, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have that kind of influence. But in the public debate, they clearly have a very strong voice, and it's a voice that's being paid attention to.
Now, you also wrote a piece recently, and I think we've talked about this before, but maybe you can give my listeners a history lesson. Iran as America's Suez moment. And it's interesting because you have said the answer is probably yo. And what you mean by yo is yes and no. So maybe you can explain this.
Indeed. So there's been some debate about comparing this to the Suez moment, if you wish. The Suez moment was essentially the then Egyptian President Jamal Abdel Nasser nationalizing the Suez Canal Company and the Suez Canal as such, and the Brits and the French being radically opposed to that because it undermined their interests and their control. And as a result of that happened is Israel used a raid in Gaza in 1955 as an excuse to attack Egypt in 1966. The British and the French intervened on behalf of Israel against Nasser, and all three countries were forced to retreat by the then U.S. President Eisenhower. And Eisenhower put his foot down and basically said, we're going to cut off financial aid, and we're going to cut off aid that you get from the International Monetary Fund if you don't withdraw. And that moment was perceived as the final breath, if you wish, of Britain and France as empires. And so the question that's being raised is whether this is the Suez moment of the United States. And there are aspects in the comparison that are very similar, without question. But there are also very important differences. And the differences include the United States in 1956 was not a combatant in the war. It was a superpower capable of imposing its will. In 2026, the United States is a superpower that is a combatant, and there's no one that can impose their will on the United States. And so that's a very different moment. With the demise in 56, with the final demise, or the final, one historian called it the final thrashes of the British and French empires, there was an alternative waiting in the wing. That was the United States. There is no alternative in the full sense of the word. So militarily, politically, economically, and with that kind of ambition and political will waiting in the wings. So that's why I said it's yes and no.
I also wanted to ask you, since the last time we've talked, the Houthis have entered this war. How do you think that, I don't want to say changes things, but what's the implications of that?
Well, I think we need to talk about potential implications. In other words, the Houthis have declared that they've entered. They've fired missiles and drones with very little effect at Israel since their declaration, a week ago or so. First of all, Israel hasn't responded, which is atypical. Doesn't take Israel very long to respond to a missile attack. And we saw that during the Gaza war, when the Houthis were firing missiles and drones at Israel with some effect, and interrupting shipping in the Bab al-Mandab. We haven't seen that. So the Israelis basically have cold-shouldered the Houthis until now. I think also the Houthis are being very calibrated. They want to be seen to being supporting Iran, but they're doing that in a very measured fashion. They have threatened to interrupt shipping in the Bab al-Mandab, which connects the Suez Canal to the Indian Ocean, but they haven't done anything about it. And presumably the reason for that is that they've had for the last 3.5, 4 years a de facto ceasefire with Saudi Arabia. They don't want to disrupt that because they hope to extract funding from the Saudis, and may have extracted funding from the Saudis. That's not clear. On the other hand, they pose a serious threat. I mean, at this point, Saudi Arabia, together with the UAE, is the only Gulf country that can circumvent the Strait of Hormuz for some of its oil exports. If the Houthis enter the war for the Saudis, that means their western ports, particularly Yambo, are compromised, and their access through the Bab al-Mandab is compromised. So I think the Houthis know that, and it's a trump card they can play.
I also wanted to ask you, and I don't know that you've written about this in the past few weeks, but Israel is also having issues, I guess, because, I mean, they're part of this Iran war, but there's also the conflict, the Israeli-Lebanese conflict. How do you think this all connects, and what does it mean for Israel?
Well, first of all, I mean, there are multiple connections. First and foremost, of course, Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shiite militia, is Iranian supported, and has gone as far as saying that in some of its attacks in this war have been coordinated with Iran. And Iran is very clear about its relationship with Hezbollah. So in that sense, they're connected. They're also connected in the sense that the Iranians have said they're not just looking for an end to the hostilities in Iran. They're looking to an end of the hostilities in Lebanon, first and foremost, Iraq, but most importantly, Lebanon. That's something that is likely to be rejected by the United States. It's certainly been already rejected by Israel. Israel's made its intentions in recent days very clear in terms of wanting to carve out a buffer zone that goes 30 kilometers deep into Lebanon, up until the Litani River, and that to ensure that that buffer zone works, it is going to do to southern Lebanon what it did to cities in Gaza, which is obliterate them, blow up the housing, expel population, and they've been very clear about that. And the United States has not, in any form or fashion, opposed that.
Do you think there's anything that, I'm just curious because you're good at reading through the lines. Is there anything that the media or, the different pundits, whether it's Kagan or whether it's someone on the right or the left, whether it's a Carlson or, whatever, are there things that are not being picked up upon that need to be really examined in regards to this bigger sort of conflagration in the Middle East?
One thing I noticed in recent days is that the reporting is too uncritical of the United States. To give you an example, the New York Times reported recently that one of the problems that the United States had was that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner didn't know who to talk to in Iran. And the reporting was based on Western intelligence sources who said that they were reading intercepted messages, which showed that there was confusion within the Iranian government. The fact of the matter is, Kushner and Witkoff are talking to the same people. They were talking prior to the war. Their main interlocutor remains Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister. There has been no public visibility or indication of confusion within the Iranian regime, of contradictory statements. They've spoken more or less with one voice. We had one incident where the president apologized and talked about ending the attacks on the Gulf, but that was once in 4 weeks. And he's still the president, and he's still representing Iran. So, and the other side of the coin is that the Iranians have a deep distrust of Witkoff and Kushner for their own reasons. None of this was reflected in that story. And I found that problematic. Not to say that I'm necessarily questioning the veracity of the story, but there was more counterbalancing that should have been in that story rather than accepted at face value.
Yeah, it's interesting because the thing I've noticed is I've seen a few mainstream pundits, chief among them Jon Stewart, who ultimately he's more of a comedian than a commentator. He's a comedian that commentates, but there's this whole thing of asking why would the Iranians attack, the Gulf states? And it's kind of bizarre to me that that's the number one question that a lot of mainstream pundits have right now.
To a degree, it is a legitimate question.
Yeah, I don't want to say it's completely illegitimate, but go on.
Yeah, and let's face it, the Iranians will pay a price for that. They these are relations. First of all, as the Gulf states say, we live in this region. Both of us do, and we're going to have to coexist, like it or not. And that's true. And this is clearly not a way of coexisting. On top of which, the Iranian argument that, oh, we're targeting U.S. military facilities and facilities that support the U.S. war effort. Fact of the matter is that they've targeted civilian infrastructure. Now, does the U.S. Air Base in Qatar use the water system of Qatar for water on the base? It probably does. Almost certainly does. Do they use Qatari gas and oil for their facilities? I'm sure they do. But that's stretching the definition of endorsing or aiding the war effort as such. With other words, allowing bases to be used, contributing forces, whatever it may be. So there's legitimacy to that argument. Now, the other side of the coin is that for the Iranians, this was for the longest period of time a fight for survival. And so you're going to do what you think is necessary and worry about the consequences later. That's one part of it. The other part of it is that what this is also designed to do, and it's going to backfire, is try and persuade the Gulf states that that hosting of U.S. military bases is a double-edged sword, that it's a liability that endangers their security. And there's an element of truth to that, but the opposite is true too. And ultimately, you're going to see tighter relations with the United States, as problematic as the United States may be. And the final remark I'll make on this is the marshaling of the Armada, as Trump called it, is beyond reach of Iranian missiles and drones. There are no U.S.-Israeli targets in Iran. There are no U.S. companies operating, whatever it may be. So by definition, if you're going to strike against U.S. targets, it's going to be on somebody else's soil.
So would you say Iran has made a really big strategic error then in attacking the Gulf states?
Let me put it this way. Iran was in a catch-22. At least it was in a catch-22 if its response to the U.S.-Israeli attack was going to be anything else than defensive. Because the only thing they could have done, theoretically, would have been defensive on their own territory. They don't have the military capacity for that. There is, they, in conventional military terms, are no match for the Israelis and the Americans. So if they were going to offensively respond, and particularly with the strategy that they had, which was increase the pain for others as a way of pressuring the United States and Trump, this was the only way to do it. But it's not for free.
Right, it has a cost.
It has a cost.
With regards to how the Gulf state, this drives the Gulf states closer to the U.S. just by.
Well, also it essentially, the principle that you had in the few years prior to, or since 2023, let's say, but actually a little bit earlier than that, which was that Middle Eastern states, not just the Gulf states, but first and foremost the Gulf states, wanted to freeze their disputes with others in the region, whether that was Iran, whether that was Turkey, and try and manage those relations in ways that the focus would be on the areas where they can cooperate, and the differences would be managed so they didn't spin out of control. That's turned out to be a failed policy. That's not a policy that the Gulf states are going to return to. They're going to return to a policy where they want security guarantees. I mean, the Iranians want security guarantees. Sorry, the Iranians want security guarantees, so do the Gulf states. And it's a legitimate demand. And so that whole relationship with Iran will fundamentally change.
I hope this doesn't sound uninformed, but it seems like these relations are always in flux, in the sense that, back in the days of the Obama administration, Obama was sort of saying to the Gulf states and Israel, you're going to have to learn to share the neighborhood, so to speak, but now it's a situation where the Saudis are like, well, but Iran doesn't want to share the neighborhood in the sense that they're bombing us. So it seems like there's constantly new developments that prevent any kind of diplomatic solution.
Look, would Iran have attacked the Gulf states if the United States and Israel had started a war? Not at this point. On the contrary, Trump prides himself as being the first president in 47 years to have the guts of taking Iran on. There was a reason why the presidents in the last 47 years didn't want to take Iran on militarily, even if the Israelis wanted that, because they understood the risks. And they understood that you would potentially end up with a situation that was worse than what you had before. And, again, keep in mind that the arguments that were made for this war are problematic. Just to take one, Rubio the other day, the Secretary of State, the other day said, well, they have short-term missiles. There's only one reason they have them, to attack the Gulf states. Fact of the matter is that almost every state in the world has weapons that are capable of attacking their neighbors. In other words, the solution to this is not stripping a nation of their deterrence capabilities.
Well, it's almost like we're saying, well, this sovereign nation isn't allowed to be a sovereign nation.
Exactly. The other part of this is, there is by and large unanimous agreement that Iran at no point was close to 2 weeks to developing a nuclear weapon. And I think what gets lost in this is, sure, Iran today, buried or not, has some 400 something kilograms of 60% enriched uranium. The history of that enrichment was not a process of nuclear weapons development. It was 2018, Trump walked away from the agreement to curb Iran's nuclear program. Iran, for the first year, abided by to the letter of the agreement, in the hope that that would create the pressure on the United States, on Trump, to return to the agreement. When Trump refused to return to the agreement after a year, Iran gradually enriched all the way up to 60%. Now, Iran may today think very differently about a nuclear weapon as a result of what's happened. But it didn't enrich for the purpose of a nuclear weapon. It enriched for the purpose of creating the kind of pressures that would force people back to the negotiating table.
Before we close out, I guess what I was trying to get at when I mentioned Obama era policy versus Trump versus Biden and how everything has continually kept changing in the intervening years is I think there's a lot of people that want a one size fits all answer for why the Middle East is so unstable. Um, and I'm not sure there's a one size fits all answer. Some people say, "Oh, it's all the U.S. and it's American imperialism," or they'll say it's the Gulf states, or they'll say it's all Israel. I'm curious, what do you think the key factors are? I mean, why is stability so elusive in the Middle East? Or am I going too far in saying that it's elusive?
Well, it's clearly elusive. Just look at the
Right.
Middle East.
I'm trying to
I mean,
question myself though. Am I like what?
I
What?
mean, I
Because I don't want to.
understand. I understand. I
Mhm.
understand, but I think the facts on the ground speak for themselves. I don't think there's one answer. Um, I think it's still true that one central issue is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, does that mean that once you have a Palestinian state, the Middle East turns into paradise? No. Relations between an Israeli and a Palestinian state are going to be very complex relationships. And just think of India and Pakistan. But without a resolution of that conflict, you're going to have instability. And the belief that now one of the interesting things is that one reason why Netanyahu for the last 30 whatever years has declared Iran rather than the Palestinians being uh, the gravest existential threat to Israel was because it replaced the Palestinians with whom he didn't want to deal. Now, what happens if the Iran war miraculously were to result in regime change that is more amenable to Israel and the United States, or if Iran descends into chaos and anarchy far from the borders of Israel, Palestine issue returns with a bang. So it is one issue. Um, Iran's posture is another issue, and if anything, an Iran, if you look in the evolution over the last 4 weeks of what Iranian goals are, the Iranian goal is no longer survival. As far as they're concerned, they have survived. The goal is now establishing leverage and capitalizing on the achievement of survival to enhance Iranian regional leverage. So Iran remains a second source of instability. And then, of course, you have failed states. You have Syria, however you want to describe Lebanon, Yemen. If Syria does not develop economically and is able to cater to the economic needs of a country that's been shattered and that needs to be reconstructed, you're going to have a very angry generation. So there are multiple factors here. Does U.S. policy play a role in this? Of course it does.
Yeah, and I guess real quick, when I was saying I don't want to say it's so elusive as to be impossible, I think there's certain racist attitudes where people will think, well, there can't be stability because it's just backwards. So that's why I was trying to like push back on
Yeah, but
myself because I don't want to
let's
fall
be
in.
clear. It's racism on all sides. I mean, with other words, sure, there's the anti-Muslim bias, and but there's also the anti-Semitic bias in the discussions about Israel. And so, there's blame to go round. There's enough of it.
So this is a loaded question, but you said Iran. Uh, I'm getting all the states mixed up. You said Iran perceives itself as already having achieved uh, its first objective of survival. Do you think they're overstepping in thinking that, or have they essentially reached that objective? What's your analysis?
Look, first of all, this is not the first time that Iran's been here. If you go back, uh, you had the Iraqi assault on Iran in September of 1980, which was backed and funded by the Gulf states. You had in the middle, barely 2.5 years after the revolution, and in the middle of a war, the killing of a president, of a prime minister, of 72 members of parliament, including prominent clerics, in a bombing. Iran's still there. The Islamic Republic's still there. You had multiple significant popular mass anti-government protests. You had the 12-day war in June of last year. You've had assassinations before. Iran's still standing. In their mind, they look at the last 32, 33 days of the most massive assault since the Iran-Iraq war on Iran, and probably more massive, in fact. They're standing strong. They've maintained regime cohesion. They're capable of waging an asymmetric warfare, which has allowed them to shape the battlefield, not the Americans and not the Israelis. Like it or not, that is success.
Two more brief questions. Since you mentioned the Iran-Iraq War, it's interesting to me. A lot of people, a lot of people within our circles will talk about 1953 and the overthrow of Mossadegh as being a big issue for why Iran distrusts the U.S. But it's odd to me that very few of those same people put a focus on the Iran-Iraq War. I mean, Saddam was using nerve gas, and U.S. officials knew about that. Do you think that the Iran-Iraq War gets overlooked in regards to how people view the bad blood between the U.S. and Iran?
Look, first of all, you can go back earlier than 1953 in terms of shaping Iranian attitudes. Go back to the 1940s, where parts of Iran were occupied by the Russians and the Brits during World War II. So there's a long history of this. The Iran-Iraq war is important. It shaped a generation.
Yeah, and the reason I
They,
say that is because I assume a lot of the officials there today remember what happened in the 80s, even more because the ones from the 50s are long gone, but
sure, sure. No, absolutely. I mean, much of the political leadership remembers it. Much of the military and Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps remembers it. Now, the footfolk in those troops may not remember it firsthand, but the commanders certainly do. And there's no question that that is part of what shapes Iranian thinking. I mean, the Iranian perception, now, again, they're not innocent in this, but the Iranian perception is that the United States and others have been gunning for the overthrow of the Islamic Republic since day one. And they have felt that they were being encircled if they looked at US bases, US allies, that they were being encircled. And so what in a sense they tried to do is duplicate that in terms of encircling Israel. Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen. I mean, that's the world in which these guys operate.
very last thing, who do you think are going to be the primary players in deciding where the next phase of this war ends up going? I know you've talked about the Gulf states in this regard in a recent piece about the shaping of Iran war's next phase. Uh, what do you see as the key factors and players that will decide where this heads next?
Sorry. First of all, um, what I was arguing is that if the Gulf states, or some Gulf states, were to actively, aggressively engage in combat with Iran in whatever form or fashion, that would be a significant challenge to Iran's strategy. Because if Iran's strategy is to use the Gulf states and the attacks on the Gulf states as one component of building pressure on the United States, the moment the Gulf states are active combatants, they're no longer going to be pressuring the United States. So in that sense, what individual Gulf states, the United Arab Emirates first and foremost, and the Gulf states as such decide in terms of prosecution of the war makes them immediately a player. What happens when the guns fall silent? I think it's going to depend a lot on how the guns fall silent. I mean, you know, there's no way that the United States is not going to be a player. The rulers of Iran are going to be a player. Clearly, the Israelis will be a player with potentially constraints imposed on them by the United States. And the Gulf states will demand to be at the table. I think it was, you know, important if you go back to last weekend when you had the Pakistanis, the Egyptians, the Turks, and the Saudis meeting in Islamabad to discuss mediation. The Saudi presence there was for two reasons. One is it's been discussing deepening military relationships with the other three countries, Pakistan, with whom it has a mutual defense treaty, Turkey and Egypt. But it was also saying, we want a seat at the table when this is being negotiated.
Um, in closing, I mean, I just don't know where this heads next. I think that's the big problem with covering this is I don't know if you'd agree, but I think Trump is just very erratic. I mean, he could just say, well, we won tomorrow and you know, things change, or this could go on for who knows how long. It just seems like everything's very up in the air at all times.
Well, again, whether he's being erratic or whether he's being deliberately unpredictable is, you know,
The madman
anyone
theory. Yeah.
is anyone's guess. Uh, I don't know what the answer to that is. And as a result, I don't know how this is going to end. It could still end with a unilateral U.S. withdrawal. It could end, you know, it could take an escalation that makes it very difficult to end. You could see an escalation that opens a door to ending the conflict. At this point, I think all you can do is draw up scenarios. I certainly wouldn't want to predict.
How can my listeners keep up with your work, plug the Substack, and what do you hope my listeners get out of this particular conversation?
Well, what I hope is a deeper understanding and maybe some lessening of the degree of confusion. I may be as confused as everybody else.
There's a lot of
But
confusion to go around right
there's a
now.
lot of confusion to go. There's as much confusion as there is blame to go around. Um, but I do hope that you know it informs listeners and allows them to form their own opinions.
Is there a key
Um,
takeaway that you want from my listeners?
Look, I think the key takeaway is that this war was unnecessary and a huge mistake. for which everybody is going to pay a heavy price, including those who didn't have a say in this. I think
So
that's
Europe, America, Iran, Israel, the Gulf, you're saying it's all bad news all the way around.
It's all bad news all the way around. Absolutely. Which is not, a defense of any one country, the Iranians or others. It's just a matter of fact. If your listeners believe that this conversation was beneficial, helped their understanding, then I would urge them to subscribe to my Substack column, which is The Turbulent World with James M. Dorsey at jamesmdorsey.substack.com.
And thank you again, James Dorsey, for being so gracious with your time and joining the program.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, JG. Thank you for having me.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers' credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Fabian, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Aaron, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Nobody, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/parallaxviews, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program. Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with JG Views. To Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.